The Z chassis is an unfolding book that has defined Nissan for 7 legendary chapters. The S30 and S130 chassis defined a generation of Grand Touring cars for over a decade, but in the early 80s an all-too-forgotten Z was introduced to the world. I'm speaking, of course, about the Z31. So why was it forgotten? Why should it be remembered? And as always, what makes it so great? Coming off the heels of the beloved 280ZX, Nissan kept the formula of the Z mostly the same. A long pointy hood, sleek 2+2 cabin, and beautifully flat rear end were all stylistic staples of the Z chassis. But hitting the scene in 1983, the Z31 transformed what a GT car could be. Pop-up headlights replaced the classic conical lights of previous generations. A stylized digital dashboard, voice warning system,
right door is open,
and asymmetrically placed hood scoop showed the world that the dated Datsuns of old were dead, and the Nissan-branded ZX was the future of the company. The X in ZX was meant to display the car's creature comforts and driver luxuries over the purely sports touring roots of the chassis. It had 3-way adjustable suspension on the turbocharged models that allowed the driver to soften or stiffen the shocks electronically. All models featured either a 5-speed manual or 4-speed auto, pushing power to the rear wheels with an R200 differential. The turbo models receiving a limited slip. Leather seats, a body sonic audio system, and removable T-tops on the roof made the Z31 one of the most enjoyable cars in its class to actually drive on a daily basis. Unfortunately, all of this came at a cost of weight, with some configurations weighing upwards of 3,200 pounds. That's as much as my all-wheel drive 4-door Subaru. So what was Nissan putting under the hood of the Z31 to make it competitive? The long hood of the Z31 echoed the first 2 generations of the Z, which required a large engine bay to fit the long inline-6 L-series engines. The Z31, however, was fitted with the newly designed VG series of V6 engines. These were the first mass-produced V6 engines to come out of Japan, and boy did they set the standard high. Designed to be a far more compact and efficient package, the Z31 would receive 4 different versions of the V6 across 4 separate models. Originally shipping in a single overhead cam 3-liter variant, it produced a modest 160 horsepower and 170 foot-pounds of torque. Up 30 horsepower from the S130 chassis, the prized 300ZX turbo model would receive the VG30 ET. Still a single cam motor, but featuring either a Garrett T3 or T25 turbo, pushing power up to 200 to 230 horsepower and 230 to 250 foot-pounds of torque. Then came along the rare 300ZR model with the ever-famous VG30 DE motor. A double overhead cam variant pushing an incredibly smooth, naturally aspirated 190 horsepower and 190 foot-pounds of torque. But the Z31 wasn't always a 300ZX. There are 2 variants with the lower displacement 2-liter motors sold under the name 200Z. The 200Z, ZS, and ZG chassis housed a rare VG20 ET, turbocharged, intercooled, single-cam V6. Its 170 horsepower and 160 pound-feet of torque is described as gutless due to the engine's shorter stroke length. A rare 5th chassis of the Z31, the 200ZR, was the last of the Z chassis to feature an inline-6 engine. Under the hood was the familiar RB20 DET inline-6 out of the Skyline chassis at the time. In this configuration, it made 210 horsepower and 190 foot-pounds of torque. Although there were 5 separate engine options, most performed extremely similar to the rest, with close horsepower and torque figures between the mid-price Z trims, and only small differences between the chassis. Oh, and get this, there were also 2 more limited run chassis produced. In 1984, Nissan celebrated their 50th anniversary as a company, so of course the 300ZX Turbo model got a special edition release. In 1988, there was the Shido Special model. It glowed with a white-on-white paint job, as the name would suggest, and performance-oriented upgrades such as a viscous LSD, Recaro seats, and stiffened suspension components. The Z31 had struck the balance between comfort and performance, but when really pushed to its limits, how did it perform? We can't talk about the history of the Z31 without mentioning the legend that is the Hudson Hornet.
Let's see how you handle these back roads. You and me.
I mean, sorry, the man who played Doc Hudson in Pixar's Cars, Paul Newman.
Sheriff, why don't you go down and get yourself a quart of oil that flows? On me.
An Academy Award-winning actor who found his own love of motorsports after undergoing pre-production training for the 1969 film Winning. He would go on to compete in the Sports Car Club of America, winning 4 championships, and even in the 1979 24 Hours of Le Mans in a screaming Porsche 935, in which he would place first in his class and second overall. Yeah, Newman wasn't messing around behind the wheel. He had true racing talent. During his SCCA career, he would team up with Bob Sharp, a longtime Datsun Nissan fan, and race in a 510, 280ZX, and finally the Z31 300ZX Turbo. Going on to take a win at Lime Rock in the 1986 Trans Am Series and an SCCA GT1 championship win in 1985. Newman and his teammate Jim Fitzgerald would qualify first and second respectively and run away from the majority V8 powered pack with their turbo V6 motors and Stout Z31 chassis. Although not strictly a Z chassis, I believe the Nissan GTP ZX Turbo deserves a mention here as well because of the VG30 ET motor housed under the hood. Sharing a rumored near-stock bottom end with the Z31, Electromotive managed to push the single-cam V6 turbo engine north of 1,000 horsepower. Despite the Z31's many shortcomings, it still sold like hotcakes with a production run of over 300,000 units over its 6-year lifetime. Today, because of its relative commonality when compared to the classic S30 chassis and more desirable Z32, the Z31 fills a more budget-friendly niche for Z enthusiasts and is often overlooked by the layman. However, if you would like your very own 80s GT car with a great motor and a decent chassis, the Z31 may be the car for you. So I hope you've learned a thing or two about a car that's typically overlooked. I hope you learned what makes it so great.
I told you, you need heat.
Thanks for watching.